The sun hung low over Clark Air Base on January 31, 1945, casting sharp reflections across the metal skin of an abandoned Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. Its fuselage, long and perfectly cylindrical, looked almost too clean for a machine left behind in the chaos of retreat. Major Frank T. McCoy paused before climbing the wing, feeling the weight of a moment he could not yet name. Inside the inspection panel, he found what no American engineer believed possible. The fuel tanks, thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel, were sealed by nothing more than a thin layer of aluminum.
No armor.
No self-sealing rubber. No protection at all. In that silent, sunlit cockpit, McCoy realized this was not a flaw. It was a philosophy.
The choice.
And it would rewrite everything the United States believed about Japanese aviation and Pacific War air power. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber had terrorized the early months of the war with its impossible range and sudden strikes. But what kind of war machine traded survival for reach? What kind of design accepted that a single bullet might destroy plane and crew alike?
To understand this aircraft is to confront the cost of decisions made long before the first shot was fired.
Long before the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber cast its shadow across Pacific War air power, the Japanese Navy faced a problem no other nation had solved. Its empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean with naval bases scattered like distant stepping stones. Any future conflict would demand an aircraft capable of reaching targets far beyond the range of carrier groups striking deep and returning home without relying on refueling or forward bases. In 1937, those requirements were distilled into a single directive to Mitsubishi: build a land-based bomber that could fly farther faster and with heavier payloads than anything then in service. To meet this challenge, engineer Kiro Honjo took over the project and confronted a brutal equation. Fuel created range. Range created power. But fuel was heavy, and every kilogram added to protection systems reduced the distance the aircraft could travel. Armor plating, fire suppression lines, self-sealing fuel tanks. In Western doctrine, these were essential barriers between a crew and the realities of war. In Honjo's calculations, they were obstacles. If he kept them, the bomber would never achieve the reach demanded by naval strategists. If he removed them, the aircraft might become the longest ranged weapon in the Pacific, and its crews would be exposed to extraordinary danger. Honjo made his choice. The G4M would be built light, almost impossibly light for its size. Its unprotected fuel tanks would stretch along the thickest portion of the wings, maximizing capacity and minimizing structural weight. What emerged was a bomber whose aerodynamic purity belied its hidden cost. On paper, the numbers were remarkable. In the air, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber would become the embodiment of Japanese ambition. When the war began in December 1941, that ambition erupted onto the world stage. At Clark Field in the Philippines, the Betty arrived not as a fragile machine, but as a force of devastation. Flying at high altitude beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns, its formations dropped hundreds of bombs across runways and hangars. Within minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been rendered nearly helpless. The attack marked the first demonstration of the long-range punch that would define Pacific War air power in its early months. 2 days later, the Betty shook naval history. 26 G4Ms armed with Type 91 torpedoes descended on HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The torpedoes, engineered for shallow waters, struck with surgical precision. In less than 2 hours, 2 British capital ships lay on the ocean floor, a feat theorists had debated for decades, but no Air Force had ever achieved in combat. Through early 1942, the Betty extended its reach even further. It struck Darwin from extraordinary distances. It crossed mountain barriers toward Port Moresby. It reached Guadalcanal from Rabaul, projecting a level of Pacific War air power unmatched by any Allied aircraft.
No one outside Japan yet understood what made this performance possible.
No one yet knew that deep inside those wings, the thin metal skins covered unprotected fuel tanks, waiting for the first burst of American gunfire to reveal the truth. For the first 6 months of the Pacific War, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber seemed almost untouchable. It ranged across vast stretches of ocean, appearing without warning, striking with precision, and vanishing before Allied fighters could respond.
But by mid-1942, the conditions that had allowed the Betty to dominate were beginning to disappear.
American fighter strength increased, training sharpened. Airfields like Henderson Field on Guadalcanal brought fighters closer to the front. Slowly, methodically, the balance of Pacific War air power shifted. The turning point came during the Guadalcanal campaign, a crucible where every flaw in Japanese aviation doctrine was laid bare. On August 8, 1942-23, Betty bombers rose from Rabaul, their crews believing they would meet only scattered resistance. Instead, American Wildcats and early arrival Warhawks intercepted them over Savo Island. What followed was a slaughter. 18 of the 23 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were shot down. Nearly 120 aviators died in the span of minutes. American pilots reported that the aircraft went up like torches, often erupting into fire after only a few hits. What they did not yet know was that those thin, gleaming wings concealed unprotected fuel tanks that offered no chance of survival once struck. Through August and September, the pattern repeated. Betty formations would approach Guadalcanal in disciplined lines only to be met by F-4F Wildcats or later F-4U Corsairs. The moment cannon shells tore into the wings, the aircraft bloomed into orange fireballs, falling into the sea or jungle below. Pilots began calling them one-shot lighters, a grim nickname earned not through disrespect but through sheer observation. The Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, once feared for its reach, had become one of the most vulnerable aircraft in the Pacific sky. The shock deepened when Allied intelligence teams began examining abandoned Japanese aircraft. In November 1942 at Buna in Papua New Guinea, air intelligence officers discovered their first physical proof. Inside the wing panels, where they expected layers of rubber and armor, they found only bare metal. No sealing compound, no protective coating,
No fire suppression lines.
not even a rudimentary barrier separating fuel from incoming rounds. The absence was so absolute that engineers doubted, at first, it could be standard design. But every Betty they inspected told the same story. By the time American forces captured an intact bomber at Clark Field in January 1945, the truth was undeniable. Major Frank T. McCoy's technical team documented the structure in exhaustive detail, confirming that the aircraft carried 8 large unprotected fuel tanks positioned in the most vulnerable part of the wing. The weight saved by eliminating protection systems had given the G4M its extraordinary range, but the price was catastrophic. American analysis showed that a properly protected Bomber 1 with the self-sealing fuel tanks common in U.S. designs would have weighed hundreds of kilograms more, but had a far greater chance of bringing its crew home alive. In the crucible of the Guadalcanal campaign, mathematics became fate. Range had won the first months of the war, but survival or the lack of it would determine the rest. By 1943, the weaknesses of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber were no longer theoretical. They were written in wreckage across the islands of the South Pacific. Each mission revealed the fatal cost of relying on unprotected fuel tanks, and each loss chipped away at the force Japan had once projected with confidence. The aircraft that had opened the Pacific War air power gap was now caught in a battle it had never been designed to survive. The most symbolic moment came on April 18, 1943. American codebreakers had intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's travel schedule, a rare opportunity to strike the architect of Japan's early successes. To intercept him, 16 P-38 Lightnings flew more than 400 miles at wave-top height, threading the open ocean by dead reckoning alone. When they climbed into the morning sky, at the exact calculated moment, they found Yamamoto's 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers approaching Bougainville, escorted but unsuspecting. The engagement lasted only seconds. A burst of cannon fire tore into the lead bomber's wings. Flames erupted, immediately fed by the unprotected fuel tanks that lined the wing's thickest section. The aircraft disintegrated as it fell into the jungle, killing Yamamoto and his staff. The second Betty met the same fate. For American aviators, the shoot-down demonstrated strategic precision. For Japan, it revealed the unbearable fragility built into its most important bomber. 2 years later, that fragility produced an even deeper tragedy. On March 21, 1945, 18 G4M bombers departed Kanoya Air Base, each carrying a single MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb slung beneath its fuselage. The Oka, flown by a volunteer pilot, required the bomber to bring it within 20 kilometers of an American warship before release. Laden with the massive weapon, the Betty became slower, heavier, and almost incapable of evasive movement. American radar tracked the formation long before it approached release range. Hellcats from USS Hornet rose to meet them, cutting through the formation with grim efficiency. One after another, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers ignited and fell into the sea, each explosion magnified by the volatile signature of unprotected fuel tanks. Not a single Oka reached its target. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Oka pilots died in the attempt. By then, the consequences of Japan's design philosophy had become catastrophic. Losses mounted faster than industry could replace them.
Skilled aviators, irreplaceable after years of training, were gone in minutes.
Attempts to correct the flaw came too late. A small number of G4M Model 3s were fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks, reducing range by more than 2,000 kilometers, but only a handful ever entered combat. They were drops of water in a burning sea. In the final months of the war, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber was no longer a symbol of reach. It had become a symbol of attrition, an aircraft whose performance had once shaped Pacific War air power, but whose vulnerabilities, exposed in places like the Guadalcanal campaign, had doomed both machine and crew long before Japan could change course. As American engineers and commanders absorbed the lessons of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, a stark contrast emerged between two philosophies of war. In the United States, the life of a trained aircrew was considered an asset more valuable than the aircraft itself. Aircraft could be built by the thousands. Experienced crews could not. This belief shaped every aspect of U.S. design, from layered armor around crew positions to the widespread adoption of self-sealing fuel tanks. The added weight was not a burden, it was an investment in survival. Japan had made the opposite calculation. By prioritizing range above all else, the G4M became the longest-range bomber of its class, but the use of unprotected fuel tanks transformed the aircraft into a weapon that could rarely withstand even brief exposure to enemy fire. American analysts recognized immediately that the Betty's catastrophic loss rate during the Guadalcanal campaign was not the result of tactical error. It was the predictable outcome of a design that left no margin for damage. A few bullets in the wing meant fire. Fire meant explosion. And explosion meant total loss of aircraft and crew. Allied observers abroad noted the same pattern. British intelligence officers, already shaken by the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse, studied the Betty with growing clarity as the war progressed. They understood that Japan's early dominance in Pacific War air power came not from invulnerability, but from a strategic head start, one that evaporated the moment Allied fighters could reach the same skies. Once the balance of the air shifted, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber revealed itself as an aircraft built for a war Japan hoped to fight, not the war it actually faced. Strategists in Washington and London drew broader conclusions. They saw in the Betty a warning about technological ambition divorced from survivability. No matter how impressive an aircraft's range or payload, a weapon that destroys itself faster than the enemy can destroy it is unsustainable in a prolonged conflict. The United States' emphasis on protection armor compartmentalization, self-sealing fuel tanks, gave its air forces the ability to endure, adapt, and ultimately overwhelm a foe that had burned through its most experienced aviators. By 1944, the lessons were accepted universally across the Allied world. Air power was not merely about striking first or farthest. It was about striking again tomorrow. In that regard, the unprotected fuel tanks of the Betty became a global symbol of a doctrine that could win battles, but could never win a war. When the war finally drew to its quiet, uneasy close, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber appeared once more, this time painted white, marked with green crosses carrying Japan's surrender delegation from Atsugi to Ieshima. Escorted by American fighters, the aircraft moved through the sky not as a weapon, but as a reminder. The machine that had opened the conflict at Clark Field now helped to bring it to an end. The circle had closed. Looking back, the story of the G4M is not one of simple failure or flawed engineering. It is a story about choices, hard choices made in conference rooms years before the first shot was fired. When Japanese designers removed armor, stripped away fire suppression, and left those unprotected fuel tanks stretched across the wings, they were not acting carelessly. They were pursuing a vision of Pacific War air power built on reach, speed, and offensive momentum. In the early months of the conflict, that vision worked, but in the long war that followed, the cost proved unbearable. The Guadalcanal campaign revealed what the spreadsheets in 1937 could not, that capability without survivability becomes a liability the moment the enemy adapts. As American fighters rose to challenge Japan's reach, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber transformed from a symbol of power into a symbol of attrition. Crews climbed into aircraft they knew could not protect them. They crossed oceans knowing a single hit might decide their fate. Thousands did not return. For modern readers, and for anyone who studies the ethics of warfare, the Betty forces a difficult question. How far should a nation go in pursuit of performance? What is the true cost of sacrificing protection for capability? The United States answered differently, investing in armored cockpits, compartmentalized fuselages, and self-sealing fuel tanks that gave its aviators a fighting chance. That philosophy helped ensure American air power could endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail. Today, the Betty's legacy is a quiet one, carried not in museums or monuments, but in the lessons its story continues to teach. Range alone cannot win a war.
Speed cannot replace survivability.
And no amount of ambition can justify a design that burns through the very lives it depends on. If you've watched this far, I'd like to hear your view. When you consider the fate of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, its unprotected fuel tanks, its role in the Guadalcanal campaign, its place in the evolution of Pacific War air power, what lesson stands out most to you? Thank you for exploring this chapter of history with us. The battle may be over, but the history is still being written.